Talk to yourself like this before bed, and watch what happens in 7 nights. There is a moment, every single night, that most of us walk past without noticing. It happens right after the lights go off, right after the phone gets set down, right in that thin, quiet space between the day you just survived and the sleep you're about to fall into. Most people fill that moment with noise, a show still playing, a scroll that never really ends, a worry replaying itself for the 9th time, uninvited, like a guest who won't leave the party. But some people, a rare few, have discovered something almost nobody teaches us. They've discovered that this moment, this small, unguarded sliver of time, is not empty. It is fertile ground. And what you plant there does not disappear when you fall asleep. It grows in the dark, the way roots grow, unseen, unglamorous, and utterly decisive. Because here is the truth nobody says out loud. You are always talking to yourself. Always. The question was never whether you talk to yourself. The question is whether anyone is listening, whether you are listening, and whether the voice doing the talking is one you would trust to raise a child, run a business, or hold your hand through a storm. Most of us inherited our inner voice the way we inherited our accent, without choosing it. A tone borrowed from a tired parent. A verdict borrowed from a teacher who saw 10 seconds of us and mistook it for the whole story. A harshness borrowed from a culture that confuses cruelty with discipline, that tells us we must be whipped forward like animals instead of called forward like human beings. And so, most nights, that inherited voice takes the microphone in the dark and says the same tired things. Asterisk, you didn't do enough today. You're behind. You're not who you should be by now. Asterisk, and we call this being hard on ourselves, as if harshness were the price of growth, as if a plant grows faster when you scream at the soil. It doesn't. Here is the first quiet revelation. The way you speak to yourself in the dark becomes the architecture of who you are in the light. Not metaphorically, psychologically. The mind does not clock out at bedtime. It takes the last words you gave it and uses them as instructions. Sleep is not a blank tape. It is a rehearsal room. And whatever you rehearse, you get better at. So imagine, just for 7 nights, doing something almost embarrassingly simple. Before you close your eyes, you speak to yourself, not with empty positivity, not with hollow slogans, but with the voice of someone who has actually earned wisdom, the voice of an elder, the voice you'd use with a child who was trying and failing and trying again. Night 1, you might just say the truth. Asterisk. Today was hard, and I showed up anyway. That's it. No exaggeration. No performance. Just witness. Because one of the deepest human hungers is simply to be witnessed, and if no one else did it today, you can do it for yourself. By night 2 or 3, something shifts. You start noticing the difference between the voice that judges and the voice that observes. Judgment says, asterisk, you failed. Asterisk, observation says, asterisk, that didn't work. What did I learn? One voice keeps you circling the same drain of shame. The other voice actually moves you somewhere. There's an old idea, older than any self-help stage, older than any bestseller. The idea that we become what we repeatedly say in private, not what we post, not what we perform for others, what we whisper when no one is grading us. Character, in the end, is just a habit of self-talk, practiced so long it hardens into identity. By night 4 or 5 you may notice the fear starting to speak up too, because growth always wakes the fear. The fear says, asterisk, who do you think you are? Changing now. This late, after all this time. Asterisk. And this is the moment most people quietly quit. Right at the threshold, mistaking the fear's noise for a stop sign, when really it's just a doorbell. Fear rings loudest exactly when you're about to become someone it doesn't recognize. So on those nights you don't argue with the fear. You don't need to defeat it like an enemy. You simply say to it what you'd say to a frightened child standing at your bedroom door at midnight. Asterisk. I hear you. I'm still here. We're safe. Go back to sleep. And astonishingly, it often does. By night 6, something has quietly rearranged itself. You start speaking to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you love, someone whose mistakes don't cancel their worth, whose bad days don't erase their whole story. You start closing each night not with a verdict but with a question. Asterisk. What did today teach me about who I'm becoming? And questions, unlike verdicts, leave the door open. They invite the mind to keep working on the answer long after the lights go out. And by night 7, and this is the part almost no one expects, you realize the goal was never to think more highly of yourself. It was to think more honestly, of yourself, with the same patience a good teacher gives a student who is still learning. Self-compassion was never the opposite of high standards. It was always the foundation underneath them. No one builds anything lasting on a foundation of contempt. This is not a trick. It is not magic. It is simply this. The last voice you hear each day quietly becomes the first voice you trust each morning. Change the voice, and eventually, without ceremony, without fireworks, you change the person listening to it. So tonight, when the lights go off, and that thin quiet moment opens up the way it always does, don't fill it with noise. Fill it. just once, with a kinder witness. Because the story of your life is being narrated every single night, whether you're paying attention or not. The only real question left is this: whose voice do you want telling it? Here it is, expanded to roughly 600 words, no headings, no conclusion, just the piece itself. There is a moment, every single night, that most of us walk past without noticing, and inside that moment lives a voice we rarely question. It happens right after the lights go off, right after the phone gets set down, right in that thin, quiet space between the day you just survived and the sleep you're about to fall into. And in that space, someone is always talking. Not out loud, not even in words sometimes, just in tone, in pressure, in the quiet verdict that settles over the day like dust. The question was never whether you talk to yourself. You do, constantly, in a running commentary so familiar you've stopped hearing it as a voice at all. You've started hearing it as truth, asterisk. But it isn't truth, it's a narrator. And narrators, as any storyteller will tell you, are never neutral. They have a point of view, they have a history, they have old wounds that color every scene they describe. So the real question, the one almost nobody stops to ask, is this: whose voice is it, really, that gets the microphone each night? Most of us never chose it. We inherited it the way we inherited our accent, without ever signing up for the transaction. A tone borrowed from a tired parent who ran out of patience before we ran out of childhood. A verdict borrowed from a teacher who caught 10 seconds of us on a bad day and mistook it for the entire story. A harshness borrowed from a culture that confuses cruelty with discipline, that tells us we must be whipped forward like animals instead of called forward like human beings, as though the only way to grow a person is to shame them into shape. And so most nights, that inherited voice takes the stage in the dark and performs the same tired monologue. Asterisk, you didn't do enough today. You're behind. You're not who you should be by now. Asterisk, we call this being hard on ourselves, as if harshness were the toll we must pay for progress, as if a plant grows faster because you shouted at the soil. It doesn't. Soil doesn't respond to volume. Neither in the end does a human soul. Here is the part that changes everything, if you let it. That narrator is not fixed. It is not carved into you like a birthmark. It is a habit, learned, repeated, reinforced by 10,000 quiet bedtime performances until it started to feel like identity itself. But anything learned can be relearned. Anything rehearsed enough times can be re-rehearsed into something else entirely. So before you accept tonight's monologue as fact, ask the question underneath the question. Not asterisk, what is the voice saying, asterisk, but asterisk, whose voice is this, and did I actually choose it, asterisk. Because somewhere underneath the borrowed harshness, underneath the inherited verdicts, there is another voice available to you. Quieter, maybe. Less rehearsed, but yours, the one that could, if invited, finally take the microphone instead. There's an old assumption most of us carry without ever examining it, that sleep is where the day ends, that once the lights go off, the mind simply powers down, like a machine switched off at the wall, and nothing more happens until morning switches it back on. It's a comforting idea. It's also wrong. Sleep is not an ending. It's a rehearsal room. And what happens in a rehearsal room is not rest, it's repetition. It's the quiet, tireless practicing of whatever was handed to it right before the curtain fell. Actors know this instinctively. Whatever you run through in the final minutes before you step off stage is the version that gets grooved into muscle memory, the version that shows up again next time, almost involuntarily. The mind works the same way. It does not clock out at bedtime and forget the day. It takes the last thoughts you gave it, the last words, the last tone, the last verdict, and it drills them, over and over in the dark, long after you've stopped being aware it's happening. This is why the ending of a day matters so disproportionately more than we give it credit for. Not because the ending erases everything that came before it, but because the ending is what gets rehearsed. If you close the day with contempt, asterisk, you failed again. You're behind. You're not enough, asterisk. The mind doesn't file that away as a passing mood. It treats it as the final instruction, the last note passed to the understudy before the show goes dark. And so it practices contempt. It gets better at contempt. Not because contempt is true, but because contempt was what got repeated. Psychologists have long understood that the brain consolidates memory and emotion during sleep, that it strengthens the neural pathways most recently activated, sorting the day's experience into what gets kept and what gets faded. What this means, stripped of the clinical language, is almost unbearably simple. Whatever emotional pattern you rehearse right before sleep is the pattern your mind will strengthen while you're unconscious to stop it. You don't get a vote in the middle of the process. The only vote you get is at the beginning, in that last waking moment, in what you choose to say to yourself before the lights go out. This is not a small mechanism. It is in many ways the quiet engine behind why some people wake up already defeated and others wake up already steady, long before either of them has faced a single event of the new day. It was decided the night before. It was decided in rehearsal. And here is where it becomes something closer to hope than science. If repetition is what builds the pattern, then repetition is also what can rebuild it. The same mechanism that has been quietly training you toward doubt, toward dread, toward the tired old verdict, can just as faithfully be redirected toward steadiness, toward clarity, toward a kind of quiet self-trust that doesn't need applause to hold its shape, not through force, not through a single dramatic night of willpower, through the same patient, unglamorous repetition that built the old pattern in the first place, just aimed, finally, in a direction that serves the person you're actually trying to become. There are two ways to speak to a person who has just failed at something, and almost all of us were only ever taught one of them. The first way is judgment. Judgment looks at what happened and hands down a verdict. Asterisk, you failed. You're lazy. You should have known better. Asterisk, it speaks in absolutes, in permanent nouns dressed up as observations. Not that didn't work, but you are the kind of person this doesn't work for. Judgment is fast. It's efficient. It requires no real investigation because it isn't actually curious about what happened. It already has its conclusion. It's just looking for the moment to announce it. And because it sounds decisive, because it sounds like accountability, most of us were raised to believe judgment was the responsible voice, the disciplined one, the one that keeps us in line. We mistook its harshness for its honesty. The second way is witness. Witness looks at the exact same event and does something quieter and far more demanding. It simply notices. Asterisk, that didn't work. I wonder why. What was I trying to do, and what actually happened instead? Asterisk, witness doesn't rush to a verdict, because witness understands that a single moment is never the whole story of a person. It's just a frame, one frame in a much longer film. Witness holds the moment up to the light without immediately deciding what it means about your worth. And because it doesn't perform outrage, because it doesn't sound dramatic or urgent, we've been trained to mistake it for weakness. We think the gentle voice must be the soft one, the indulgent one, the one that lets us off the hook. It's the opposite. Judgment keeps you circling the same drain. Because a verdict, once delivered, doesn't ask any further questions. There's nothing left to investigate once you've already decided you're simply not enough. That's the quiet trap of judgment. It feels like it's driving you forward, but it's actually just replaying the same accusation on a loop, and a loop by definition goes nowhere. Witness is the voice that actually moves you somewhere else, because witness stays curious long enough to learn something usable. It asks the question that judgment never bothers to ask. Asterisk, what now? Asterisk, think of the difference between a coach who screams you're hopeless after a missed shot, and a coach who kneels down and says watch your elbow, that's what pulled it off course, try again. Both coaches want you to improve. Only one of them is actually giving you information you can use. The other is simply discharging their own frustration and calling it motivation. This is the quiet decision available to you every single night, in that thin, unguarded moment before sleep, when the day's failures line up for their final review. You can hand the microphone to the judge, who will deliver the same tired verdict it's delivered 1,000 times before, teaching you nothing new, just deepening a groove you've been standing in for years. Or you can hand it to the witness, the voice that looks at what happened with clear eyes and genuine curiosity, that treats you the way a good teacher treats a student who is still learning, still capable, still very much in progress. One voice keeps a record of your failures. The other voice keeps a record of your growth. They are describing the exact same life. Only one of them is telling the truth. There is a strange, almost universal experience that shows up right at the exact moment someone decides to change, and because nobody warns us about it in advance, we tend to misread it completely. You make a quiet decision, alone, in the dark, to speak to yourself differently, to stop rehearsing contempt and start rehearsing something steadier, and almost immediately, a voice rises up from somewhere underneath the decision and starts asking questions. Asterisk, who do you think you are? Why now? You've tried this before, and it didn't stick. What makes tonight any different? It arrives dressed as reason. It arrives sounding responsible, even protective, and most people hearing it assume it means asterisk stop asterisk. They mistake it for a wall. It isn't a wall. It's a doorbell. Fear, it turns out, isn't actually opposed to your growth. It's just old. It was built a long time ago, often in childhood, for a version of you that genuinely needed protecting. Its entire function is to notice change and treat it as danger, because for a very young nervous system, unpredictability really could be dangerous. Fear doesn't update easily. It doesn't check the calendar. It doesn't know you're not 7 years old anymore, standing in a kitchen where the wrong move brought consequences. It just knows one thing. Something different is happening. And different, to the ancient parts of the brain, has always meant asterisk, unsafe until proven otherwise. So the moment you start speaking to yourself in a new tone, a kinder one, a steadier one, fear notices immediately, because fear's entire job is noticing shifts, and it rings its alarm, loudly, right at the threshold of the exact change you're trying to make. This is not evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're doing something real. Fear doesn't bother alerting you to changes that don't matter. It only rings this loud for thresholds that actually lead somewhere. This is the part almost nobody tells you. The fear gets loudest right before the identity shifts, not because the shift is dangerous, but because the old identity is about to lose its familiar shape, and familiarity has always felt like safety, even when it was never actually serving you. The fear isn't protecting you from harm. It's protecting an old story from becoming obsolete. And an old story, even an unkind one, fights to survive the way anything does when it senses its own ending. So what do you do with the doorbell? You don't argue with it. You don't try to silence it through sheer force, the way so many people attempt, gritting their teeth, white-knuckling through the fear as if it were an enemy to be defeated once and for all. That approach rarely works, because you cannot outshout something whose entire nature is to shout back. Instead, you answer the door. You treat the fear the way you'd treat a frightened child standing outside your room at midnight, small and shaking and certain the sky is falling. You don't scold the child for being afraid. You kneel down. You say, asterisk, I hear you. I know this feels unfamiliar, but we are safe, and I am not leaving. Asterisk. And astonishingly, more often than not, the fear, like a child who has finally been heard, grows quiet enough to let you keep walking. Not because it vanished, because it finally trusted that someone was still standing at the door, listening, instead of running from the sound. There's a quiet misunderstanding that runs through most of what we're taught about ambition, and it's this: the belief that kindness toward ourselves and high standards for ourselves are somehow enemies, that we must choose one or the other. Either we go easy on ourselves and drift, soft and unaccountable, or we go hard on ourselves and achieve something worth having. It's presented as a trade-off, almost a law of nature, as if the only two options available were indulgence or cruelty. Most people, terrified of becoming the first, choose the second and spend years mistaking self-punishment for discipline. But look closely at anyone who has built something real and lasting, not the performance of success, but the actual sustained, quiet accumulation of skill, of character, of a life someone would be proud to have lived, and you'll find something surprising. It was rarely contempt that carried them through. Contempt is a short burst fuel. It can get you through a bad week, maybe a bad month, powered entirely by the adrenaline of proving something to a voice that hates you. But contempt cannot sustain a decade. Nobody builds a cathedral standing on ground that keeps insisting they don't deserve to be building anything at all. What actually carries people through the long, unglamorous middle of any real pursuit is something closer to devotion, the kind of patient, clear-eyed care a good parent has for a child who is still learning to walk. Notice that a good parent does not lower their hopes for the child simply because they're being gentle. They still want the child to grow, to try again, to eventually run. The gentleness isn't in spite of the high hopes. It's what makes the high hopes survivable. A child who is screamed at every time they stumble doesn't learn to walk faster. They learn to stop trying in front of anyone who might scream. This is the part so often missed. Compassion was never the opposite of standards. It was always the foundation underneath them. You cannot build something that lasts on a foundation of contempt, because contempt by its nature is unstable. It requires constant proof of inadequacy to keep functioning, which means it must, on some level, keep finding you inadequate in order to justify its own existence. A person led by contempt can never actually arrive anywhere good enough, because good enough would put contempt out of a job. Compassion works differently. Compassion can hold both truths at once. Asterisk, I am not where I want to be yet, and I am still worthy of patience while I get there. Asterisk, it doesn't need you to be failing in order to justify itself. It doesn't need a verdict to keep operating. It simply keeps showing up, night after night, the way a steady coach shows up regardless of whether yesterday's practice was brilliant or clumsy, because the coach understands that consistency, not intensity, is what actually shapes a person over time. This is why the voice you use with yourself before sleep matters so much more than it first appears to. A harsh voice might produce a burst of motivation tonight, but it cannot be sustained for years without eventually breaking the very person it claims to be improving. A patient voice, on the other hand, one that treats your mistakes as information rather than indictment, is the only kind of voice capable of walking beside you for the whole distance, through the slow seasons, the uncertain ones, the years nobody applauds, which is, in the end, most of the actual distance any real growth requires. 7 nights is not a long time. It's not enough to rewrite a life, not enough to erase decades of inherited tone, not enough to turn a stranger into someone new. And yet there's something quietly significant about that number, something almost every tradition of transformation seems to have stumbled onto independently. The idea that a short, deliberate stretch of repeated attention can crack something open that years of passive drifting never could. 7 nights isn't magic. It's just long enough to notice you have a choice you didn't know you were making every single day of your life, because that's really what's at stake here, underneath all of it. Not a technique, not a bedtime ritual, but a single, quietly enormous question. Whose voice do you trust to narrate you? Most people never ask this question directly. They simply accept whichever voice showed up first, whichever tone got installed earliest, and they spend the rest of their lives assuming it was chosen rather than inherited. They call it just being realistic or just being honest with myself, never noticing that realism and honesty are not the same thing as harshness, that you can tell yourself the truth without needing to sentence yourself for it. 7 nights is enough to start separating those two things. Enough to notice, for the first time, that the voice narrating your failures at 11 at night is not the same as objective fact. It's a habit, dressed up convincingly as fact. The way an old family story gets repeated so many times, it starts to sound like history instead of interpretation. And once you can see a habit as a habit, you've already loosened its grip a little. Because habits, unlike facts, can be changed. What makes this question so quietly urgent is that you don't get to opt out of it. Silence is not neutral. If you don't consciously choose which voice gets the microphone before sleep, the oldest, loudest, most rehearsed voice will simply take it by default, the way it always has, not because it's true, but because it's practiced. Every night you don't ask the question is a night you've still answered it, just by letting the old narrator keep the job uncontested. There's a particular kind of humility required here, one that's easy to miss. It's not the humility of thinking little of yourself. That's not humility. That's just another disguise contempt wears. It's the humility of admitting that the way you've been speaking to yourself was never actually decided by you at all. It was handed down, absorbed, rehearsed so many times it started to feel permanent. And permanence, when you look closely at almost anything human, is usually just repetition wearing a very convincing costume. So the question isn't really whether you're capable of change. Capability was never the obstacle. The question is whether you're willing to notice, night after night, which voice you're handing the microphone to, and whether that voice has actually earned the trust you've been giving it for free, for years, without ever once asking it to prove it deserved the job. Some voices deserve that trust. Many were simply never interviewed for the position. They just showed up first, and nobody else ever applied.